Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Forgotten Room Behind the Wall. Sarah and Ben had always dreamed of owning an old Victorian house, and when the opportunity finally came, they jumped at it. The house, though aged and worn, had an undeniable charm. With its grand wooden staircase, ornate fireplaces, and towering windows that overlooked a sprawling garden, it seemed to promise a life of comfort and history. They could already picture the furniture, the long nights curled up by the fire, and the countless memories they would make in the house. The house had been sitting vacant for years. The previous owners, an elderly couple, had passed away, and the house had slipped into a state of disrepair. Despite its crumbling condition, Sarah and Ben saw it as a project. They were determined to restore the house to its former glory, bringing it back to life with their own touch. The first few days were filled with excitement. They stripped old wallpaper, sanded down woodwork, and carefully packed away the remnants of the previous owners' lives. But as the days wore on, things began to feel off. Strange drafts swirled through the house, even when all the windows were shut. Odd noises echoed through the empty hallways at night. Creaks, whispers, and faint scratching sounds that no one could explain. But they chalked it up to the house settling, the kind of noises old buildings make when they've been standing for so long. It wasn't until they decided to tackle the basement that they first encountered something truly unsettling. One afternoon, while Ben was working on fixing a plumbing issue in the basement, he noticed something strange. The wall near the back of the room seemed slightly off. The crumbling stone looked different, almost as if it had been patched up and forgotten over time. With a curious frown, he grabbed a hammer and began gently tapping along the edges of the wall. It gave way surprisingly easily, revealing a small door hidden behind the rubble. "Hey, Sarah, you need to see this," he called to his wife, his voice tinged with curiosity. Sarah joined him in the basement, where Ben was already clearing away the debris. The door, old and worn with age, had been sealed shut long ago. It was covered in layers of dust and cobwebs, its brass handle rusted and forgotten. They exchanged puzzled glances. The house had been vacant for so long. Why was there a sealed door hidden away in the basement? "Do you think it's some kind of storage room?" Sarah asked, her voice soft, unsure. Ben didn't respond immediately. Instead, he carefully pried open the door, the creak of the hinges sounding loud in the otherwise silent basement. They stepped inside. The room was small, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet. It was dark, the only light coming from the bare bulb overhead that cast long, eerie shadows across the room. The walls were lined with more cobwebs, and the air felt stale, as though it hadn't been disturbed in decades. At the center of the room was a simple wooden chair, facing a small, rickety table. On the table was an old, leather-bound journal. It looked out of place in this forgotten room. Ben's fingers trembled as he picked up the journal. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, but the leather felt surprisingly warm under his touch, as if it had been recently handled. He opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the first few pages. The writing was frantic, jagged, and barely legible. "I know they're watching. They watch me. They watch through the walls," one of the first entries read. I hear their whispers, their cries. I can't leave. The walls won't let me leave. They know everything. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she read over Ben's shoulder. The journal was filled with strange, disjointed entries, each one growing more disturbing than the last. The writer spoke of hearing voices in the walls, of feeling trapped in the room, and of something or someone watching them at all times. Suddenly, the air in the room seemed to grow thicker, heavier. A cold draft brushed across Sarah's skin, and she shivered. Ben set the journal down on the table and turned to Sarah. This is insane. Someone must have been living down here, or maybe they were locked in here. The room felt wrong. As they stepped back toward the door, they heard something, a faint sound, like whispers, floating up from the basement. They froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Ben nodded slowly, his eyes wide. He motioned for Sarah to stay quiet, and they both stood perfectly still. The whispers grew louder, a low murmur that seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. Sarah could barely make out the words, but they sent a chill through her. "Help me, please, they won't let me go." Ben grabbed Sarah's hand, and they both ran out of the room, slamming the door behind them. The whispers didn't stop. They continued, growing louder and more desperate, as though something or someone was pleading for help from the walls. That night, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They lay in bed, wide awake, every creak of the house, every gust of wind, setting them on edge. The whispers, though faint, continued in the back of their minds, as if they had followed them upstairs. Hours later, as Sarah lay staring at the ceiling, she heard something else. A soft, steady thump, like footsteps moving across the floor. Her heart raced, and she turned to Ben, but he was sound asleep beside her. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just the house settling, just the wind. But the thumping grew louder, closer, as though someone was walking through the hall outside their bedroom door. The next morning, Sarah woke up to find something terrifying. Muddy footprints led from the basement door, across the hallway, and right to their bedroom door. She froze in place, staring at the prints in disbelief. The footprints were fresh, still damp, as if someone had been walking around the house during the night. Ben rushed in when he heard Sarah gasp. He looked at the prints, his face going pale. They both knew something was wrong. The house wasn't just old. It was hiding something they had uncovered in that forgotten room behind the wall. They didn't stay another night. The house, once a dream, had become a nightmare. They packed their things, leaving everything behind, including the journal. As they pulled out of the driveway, they glanced back at the house, half expecting to see a figure standing in the window, watching them leave. The house stood silent, its secrets buried once more behind the walls. But for Sarah and Ben, the memory of the forgotten room and the whispers in the night would haunt them forever. Story 2. The tenant no one knew about. Alex had always prided himself on being resourceful. As a university student on a tight budget, finding a cheap apartment near campus was a dream come true. The building was old, but the rent was reasonable, and it was only a 10-minute walk to his classes. He quickly moved in, eager to settle into his new life and focus on his studies. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. The apartment was small but cozy, and it had the kind of quiet that Alex appreciated. It was in an old building with creaky floors and worn-out walls, but nothing about it felt unusual or unsettling. That was until Alex began to notice small, strange things. It started with food disappearing from his fridge. Alex was meticulous about his groceries, always keeping track of what he bought. But every now and then, something would be missing. At first, he thought he had simply forgotten that he ate it. But when his snacks started vanishing and then a whole loaf of bread went missing, Alex couldn't ignore it anymore. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. He had a busy schedule, juggling classes, studying, and working part-time at a local cafe. Maybe he was just too tired or distracted. Maybe it was his roommate, who rarely came out of his room, but when he heard strange noises late at night, scratching sounds coming from the walls, he began to feel a creeping unease that gnawed at him. One evening, after hearing the noises again, Alex stood still in his kitchen, listening intently. It wasn't the kind of noise that could be explained by old pipes or settling floors. It sounded like something moving inside the walls, like nails dragging against the plaster. His heart raced, but he tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just rats or squirrels in the building's aging structure. He wasn't the first person to live in this apartment, but when the noises continued night after night, Alex's mind began to race. One day, as he was cleaning his closet, he noticed something odd, a trapdoor in the corner of the floor. He had lived there for nearly a month and never once noticed it. His eyes narrowed in curiosity as he crouched down, running his fingers along the wooden edges. It was old, covered in dust, but it seemed to lead somewhere. Without thinking, Alex grabbed a crowbar from his toolbox and pried the door open. It creaked loudly, as though protesting its opening after years of being locked away. Beneath the trapdoor, there was a narrow crawl space. Alex felt a mix of excitement and dread. What could possibly be down there? Perhaps the building's original owners had left behind something valuable? He shone his phone's flashlight down the dark hole. The beam illuminated a small, narrow tunnel that led further into the darkness. With a hesitant breath, he crawled down, the cool air brushing his face as he moved forward. His phone's light flickered for a moment before stabilizing, casting a sickly yellow glow on the walls. At the end of the crawl space, he found a room. It wasn't much, just a small space barely large enough to sit in, but it was clearly lived in. Blankets were haphazardly strewn across the floor, and a few water bottles were scattered around. Alex's heart began to pound as he looked closer. Among the items was an empty cereal box, a partially eaten snack bar, and, his stomach twisted, one of his missing sandwiches. He squatted down, heart racing as he sifted through the clutter, finding more of his missing food items. It was impossible. A journal sat in the corner, its pages yellowed with age. Alex hesitated for a moment before picking it up. As he flipped through the pages, he found something truly disturbing. The entries weren't just the ramblings of someone living in seclusion. They were meticulously detailed accounts of his daily life. The first entry described Alex arriving at the apartment, what he was wearing, and even the exact time he moved in. Each entry followed with observations of Alex's routines. What time he woke up, what he ate, when he left for class, and when he showered. There were even detailed notes about his study habits and his part-time job. The journal's last entry sent a chill down his spine. It read, "Tonight, he's not home. I'll take his food while he's away. The walls are good to listen through, but it's better when I can see him." Alex's throat went dry. This wasn't just some paranoid ramblings of a lonely person. It was real. Someone had been watching him. Someone had been living under his floorboards, hiding in the walls, and observing every moment of his life. The thought made his skin crawl, and before he could stop himself, he stood up, heart pounding in his chest. Panicked, he scrambled back through the crawl space, hardly daring to look behind him. His mind was racing as he tried to process what he had just discovered. Who had been living in the crawl space? How long had they been there? Had they ever left? Alex grabbed his phone and called the police, his voice shaky as he explained what he had found. Within minutes, they arrived, and after hearing his story, they began to investigate. Officers pried open the crawl space, their flashlights cutting through the dark corners. When they reached the small room, Alex felt a wave of nausea wash over him. There was no way anyone could have lived there without him knowing. But then the officers found him, a man, emaciated and filthy, huddled in the corner of the room. His eyes were wide and unblinking, staring at Alex with an unsettling calm. He was barely conscious, his skin pale and drawn tight against his bones. The police immediately called for medical assistance and took the man into custody. The man, whose name turned out to be Robert, was an ex-tenant who had lived in the apartment years before Alex moved in. It seemed he had never fully left. He had been living in the crawl space for months, using the vents to watch Alex and living off his food. It was unclear how he had survived for so long, but his appearance suggested that he had grown weaker over time, perhaps as his obsession with Alex took over. Alex's world felt like it had shattered. He was just a student trying to make his way through life, and now he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, had been lurking in the shadows, watching him every single day. The apartment was never the same for him after that. He moved out shortly after the incident, leaving behind his furniture and everything that had once made it feel like home. The landlord never acknowledged the story, but Alex knew deep down that whatever dark history the building had, it was far worse than anyone realized. To this day, Alex can't shake the thought of the hidden room beneath his floorboards. Every time he moves into a new place, he always checks for trapdoors, just to make sure no one is watching from the shadows anymore. Story 3. The Children's Secret Room. When Sarah and Ben Matthews decided to leave the hustle and bustle of city life for a quieter existence in the countryside, they didn't expect their new home to come with secrets. Their children, Ellie and Max, were thrilled by the idea of living in a big, old farmhouse. The house was charming, tucked away at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by acres of farmland and trees. With its creaky floorboards and aged wooden beams, it felt like something out of an old storybook. The family's first few weeks were filled with excitement. The kids spent their days exploring the sprawling grounds, while Sarah and Ben busied themselves unpacking and settling into their new life. It was peaceful, serene, and for the most part, perfect. But things changed the day Ellie and Max discovered the door. It happened on a rainy afternoon when the children were playing in the attic. The storm had forced them indoors, and with nothing else to do, they decided to explore the dusty, forgotten spaces at the top of the house. They had found an old wardrobe, thick with dust, its wooden doors creaking when they tried to open them. Inside, they discovered something that caught their attention. A small door hidden behind the wardrobe's back panel. Max, the more curious of the two, tugged at the door with all his might. It creaked open, revealing a narrow, dark hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The kids, wide-eyed and filled with excitement, grabbed a flashlight and squeezed through the opening, eager to see what lay beyond. What they found was an old, secret room. It was tiny, barely big enough for the two of them to stand side by side. The air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew, but that didn't stop Ellie and Max from exploring. They noticed a few strange things right away. A rocking chair, old and worn, facing the far wall, shelves filled with antique toys, some missing pieces, others faded with age, and a portrait hanging crookedly on the wall. The portrait was of two children, a boy and a girl, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. The girl had a stern look on her face, while the boy seemed to smile, though the expression was unsettling. The children immediately felt a strange sense of familiarity in the room. Ellie whispered to Max, "I think we're supposed to be here." Max, nodding, agreed. It was as if the room had been waiting for them. Over the next few days, the children couldn't stay away from the room. They spent hours in there, playing with the toys, rocking in the chair, and talking to each other in whispers. They would come downstairs to eat or to say goodnight, but the moment their parents weren't looking, they would sneak back up to the attic. At first, Sarah and Ben didn't think much of it. It was harmless, right? Just kids using their imaginations, playing in an old room that hadn't been touched in years. But then, Ellie and Max started to change. Ellie began speaking in strange, old-fashioned phrases that didn't seem to belong to a 7-year-old. She would say things like, "I'll be back, don't worry. Just wait here, my dear," or "It's not safe to be outside after dark." She'd say these things with a tone that was far too serious for a child her age. At first, Sarah thought it was a phase, but when Max started repeating the same odd phrases, it made her pause. The children also started drawing on the walls of their room. Strange, twisted shapes and symbols that looked like something out of an old folklore book. Some of the names were scribbled over and over, names that Sarah and Ben didn't recognize. One name, in particular, stood out: Eleanor and Matthew. The names of the children in the portrait. One evening, when Sarah went up to check on the kids, she found them sitting in the rocking chair together, rocking back and forth slowly. Their faces were pale, and their eyes were wide, as though they hadn't blinked in hours. Ellie was humming a tune Sarah had never heard before, and Max had his arms wrapped around her, his head tilted to the side, as though listening to something only he could hear. "Hey kids, are you okay?" Sarah asked, trying to shake the eerie feeling creeping up her spine. Ellie looked up at her with those strange, wide eyes and whispered, "We're playing with our new friends." It was the first time Sarah felt truly unsettled. She tried to push the feeling away, but something about it didn't sit right with her. The next day, Sarah and Ben decided to explore the attic themselves. They knew about the door the kids had found, but something in the back of their minds told them they needed to take a closer look. When they opened the hidden room, they found it as it had been, untouched, still filled with old toys, the rocking chair gently swaying as though someone had just left. But there was something new in the room now. On the floor, just beneath the portrait, there was a new addition. Two small handprints, smudged in dust, as though a child had touched the wall. Ben had an uneasy feeling, but Sarah shrugged it off. They decided to block the room off, thinking it was time for the kids to move on and stop playing in such an odd space. They nailed a piece of wood across the door, hoping that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. That night, after Sarah and Ben had tucked the kids in a bed, they heard the rocking chair again. The soft creaking echoed down the hallway, followed by a faint humming. They looked at each other, fear creeping in. They checked on the children, sound asleep in their beds, both of them still and peaceful. The next morning, when they entered the living room, they found the rocking chair in the middle of the room, rocking on its own. The toys from the hidden room had appeared throughout the house, on the kitchen table, the hallway floor, even in the kids' rooms. But what really terrified them was the sound, the faint, soft whispers, like children calling from the attic. Sarah and Ben could no longer ignore the dark presence in the house. They had to leave. They packed their bags, took the kids, and fled the farmhouse. As they drove away, Sarah looked back at the house, the farmhouse that had once seemed like a dream. The house had been hiding its secrets well. Later, when Sarah and Ben researched the property's history, they discovered something chilling. Two children, Eleanor and Matthew, had once lived in the farmhouse over 100 years ago. They had vanished without a trace, their disappearance a mystery that was never solved. Local legends claimed they had been playing in the attic when they were last seen. The story had faded with time, but now it seemed the children's spirits were not at rest. The farmhouse had been waiting for someone to uncover its hidden room, to invite the children back. And Sarah and Ben had unknowingly done just that. But the question remained, who or what had been playing with Ellie and Max?